We always talk about home as a sanctuary, a fortress where the world stops at the threshold and the chaos of existence is held at bay by four walls and a deadbolt. But have you ever stopped to consider how thin that illusion really is? How fragile the barrier between your life and the void truly becomes when you move to the edge of the map, where the streetlights end and the silence begins. We seek out these places for peace, for isolation, for a chance to hear our own thoughts. But we forget that isolation is a double-edged sword. When you are far enough away that no one can hear you scream, you aren't just away from the noise, you are away from the protection of the herd. You are a lone figure in a dark window, a target framed by the very architecture you thought was keeping you safe. And when the shadows at the edge of your property start to move, you realize with a cold, paralyzing clarity that your sanctuary is actually just a beautifully decorated trap. I found this place on a whim, a rental listing that promised total seclusion on the northern periphery of the city. It was a brutalist slab of concrete and glass perched on a ridge, overlooking a valley that swallowed the sun 3 hours before it actually set. To me, it was a masterpiece of solitude. To them, it was a stage. I remember the first night, the way the air felt different as the city lights flickered like dying embers in the distance. There's a specific kind of quiet that exists only at the edge of civilization. Not the peaceful quiet of a park, but a heavy, expectant silence, as if the earth itself is holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I spent the evening unpacking, my footsteps echoing through the hollow rooms. The house was too large for one person, with glass walls that turned into black mirrors the moment the interior lights went on. That was my first mistake, letting the world see in while I was blind to what was looking out. The sun went down, and for a few hours, it was perfect. I sat in the living room, reading, the glow of my lamp the only defiance against the encroaching dark. But then, the first anomaly occurred. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a vibration. A low-frequency hum that seemed to come from the ground itself. At first, I thought it was the wind moving through the valley, or perhaps the heating system settling into the concrete. But it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was the sound of multiple heavy engines idling at the bottom of the long gravel driveway. I didn't get up immediately. I sat there, frozen, the logic of a city dweller trying to rationalize the irrational. Maybe it's a neighbor, I thought. Maybe someone turned around in the drive. But the engines didn't fade. They stayed there, a mechanical growl at the edge of my perception, pulsing like a heartbeat. When I finally stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the reflection of the room stared back at me, mocking my vulnerability. I had to cup my hands against the glass and press my face to the pane to see through the darkness. Down at the gate, maybe 300 yards away, I saw the silhouettes. 3 SUVs, black and matte, their headlights turned off, only their amber parking lights glowing like the eyes of deep-sea predators. They were parked in a formation that blocked the only exit. My heart didn't just beat, it slammed against my ribs, a frantic warning. I reached for my phone on the coffee table, but as I looked down, the power in the house simply died. It wasn't a flicker, it wasn't a surge, it was a surgical disconnection. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening, amplified by the sudden, absolute darkness. In that moment, the house changed. It was no longer a modern marvel. It was a glass cage. I stood there, my eyes slowly adjusting to the moonlight filtering through the trees. And that's when I saw them. They weren't staying at the gate. The doors of the SUVs had opened in unison, and figures began to emerge. Not 2 or 3, but a crowd. 10, maybe 12 men, moving with a terrifying, practiced coordination. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They walked with the slow, inevitable pace of people who knew exactly how much time they had, and exactly how little I could do to stop them. They were dressed in dark, tactical gear, faces obscured by masks or the shadows of hoods. And as they fanned out across the lawn, I realized this wasn't a robbery. This was a siege. I moved away from the window, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps. I needed to lock the doors, but the house had 5 different points of entry. Sliding glass panels, a service door in the kitchen, the main entrance, the garage. I ran through the dark, my hands grazing the cold concrete walls, feeling like a blind man in a labyrinth. Every click of a lock felt like a pathetic, tiny gesture against the sheer weight of what was coming. As I reached the kitchen, I heard the first sound of them on the property. It wasn't a voice. It was the crunch of gravel under heavy boots, a sound so loud in the stillness that it felt like it was happening inside my own skull. Then, the tapping began. It started on the west side of the house, a light, rhythmic tapping against the glass. Tap, 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 like a finger against a crystal glass. I froze in the hallway, the shadows stretching out like reaching hands. Then it started on the east side. Tap, tap, tap. They were surrounding the house, testing the perimeter, letting me know they were there, letting me know they could see me, even if I couldn't see them. It was a psychological flaying, a way to strip away my remaining sanity before the physical violence even began. I sank to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible in the middle of that vast, empty space. "I know you're in there, Elias." The voice didn't come from a megaphone. It didn't come from a distance. It was a calm, conversational tone that seemed to vibrate through the glass of the sliding door just a few feet away from where I sat. It was a voice that belonged to a man who had never been told no in his entire life. It was refined, cold, and utterly devoid of empathy. "We can do this with the glass intact, or we can do this with it shattered," the voice continued. "But you should know that the distance between us is shrinking with every second you spend thinking. This house, it's beautiful, truly, but it's a lantern in the dark, and you are the only thing inside it. Why don't you come to the door? Let's discuss the terms of your exit." I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was racing through every possible scenario, every way out. But each path led back to the same conclusion. I was trapped. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. The police, even if I could reach them, would take 20 minutes to navigate the winding ridge roads. 20 minutes is an eternity when men are already standing on your porch. I felt the vibration of the front door being tried, the heavy oak handle turning, the deadbolt holding firm for now. Then, the sound of a heavy tool being dragged across the concrete, a metallic scraping that set my teeth on edge. They weren't just banditti. They weren't looking for a quick score. The precision of their movement, the silence they maintained, the way they seemed to anticipate my every thought. This was professional. This was a hit. But I was nobody. I was a man who rented a house to write a book. Why me? Why here? The why didn't matter anymore. Only the how remained. How long until the glass gave way? How long until they stopped playing with their food? Outside, the amber lights of the SUVs were joined by a single powerful spotlight. It ignited at the base of the driveway and swept upward, cutting through the house like a blade. It washed over the living room, illuminating the dust motes in the air, the half-packed boxes, and finally, it found me. I was pinned against the wall by the light, a specimen on a slide. I could see their silhouettes now, standing just beyond the glass, their shadows cast long and menacing across the floor toward me. They didn't move. They just watched. 10 minutes, Elias, the voice whispered, closer now, as if the man was leaning his forehead against the very pane of glass I had looked through moments before. 10 minutes of peace. Use them wisely. Pray if you're the type. Or better yet, look for a place to hide. I've always enjoyed a game of hide and seek in a house with nowhere to go. The spotlight flickered off, plunging me back into a darkness that felt even heavier than before. But the tapping didn't stop. It became more aggressive. The tap, tap, tap was replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of palms against the glass. A slow, steady drumming that filled the house, echoing off the high ceilings until it sounded like a funeral march. I realized then that they weren't waiting for an answer. They were waiting for the fear to finish its work. They wanted me broken before they even stepped through the door. I crawled toward the stairs, my heart a drum in my ears. Every instinct screaming at me to go up, to find a higher ground, even though I knew the second floor was just another dead end. Every shadow in the house now had a shape. Every creak of the floorboards was a footstep that wasn't mine. I was losing the map of my own sanctuary, becoming a stranger in the place I had paid to call home. As I reached the first step, I heard the unmistakable sound of a heavy glass cutter scoring the surface of the kitchen window. A long, screeching line of intent. They were coming in. Not through the door I had locked, but through the transparency I had admired. The very thing that made the house beautiful was now its fatal flaw. I looked up the dark stairwell, the silence of the second floor feeling like a shroud. I had no weapon. I had no plan. All I had was the realization that the night was only just beginning, and the crowd outside was no longer content to stay in the shadows. The screech of the glass cutter was a sound that didn't belong in the world of the living. It was a high-pitched, crystalline scream that signaled the end of my life as a spectator and the beginning of my life as a victim. I pulled myself up the stairs, not running, because running implies a destination, but crawling, dragging my weight against the gravity of my own terror. Behind me, the kitchen window didn't shatter with a loud crash. It was a dull, heavy thud as the suction-cupped pane was pulled outward and placed gently on the grass. These men weren't vandals. They were surgeons. They didn't want noise. They wanted efficiency. I reached the landing of the second floor, my hands trembling so violently I had to tuck them under my armpits just to stop the sound of my fingernails clicking against the hardwood. From this height, the house felt like a hollowed-out rib cage, and I was the heart, exposed and pulsing. I could hear them now. The sound of soft-soled tactical boots hitting the linoleum in the kitchen, a muffled pat, pat, pat that was more terrifying than a gunshot. 1, 2, 3. I counted the footfalls. They were spreading out. They were taking the ground floor with the practiced ease of a team clearing a simulated kill house. "Check the utility room. Cut the backup lines," a voice whispered from below. It wasn't the refined voice from the window. This was a subordinate, cold, professional, bored. The backup lines. They knew about the secondary generator. They knew the layout of the house better than I did. I had lived here for 3 days. They had likely studied the blueprints for weeks. Every design choice I had loved, the open floor plan, the lack of interior doors, the minimalist aesthetic, was now a tactical nightmare. There was nowhere to duck, nowhere to create a bottleneck. I moved toward the master bedroom, the only room with a heavy door. But as I reached for the handle, I stopped. A door is just a signal. If I lock myself in, I'm just telling them which box the prize is in. I looked down the long gallery hallway that overlooked the living room. Below, I saw the sweep of a tactical light. It was a tight, blue-white beam that cut through the darkness like a laser. It moved across my bookshelves, over the empty fireplace, and then tilted upward. I threw myself flat against the floor, the cold wood pressing against my cheek, as the light swept over the ceiling just inches above my head. I could smell them now. Not the smell of criminals, but the smell of gear, cordura, gun oil, and the sharp ozone scent of the rain that was finally starting to fall outside. I needed a weapon. My mind raced through the inventory of a writer's life. A laptop? A fountain pen? A kitchen knife I hadn't even unpacked yet? I was a man of words in a world that was currently being redefined by steel. Then I remembered. The previous tenant, a hunter or a survivalist, had left a heavy fire poker by the hearth in the master bedroom. It was a crude iron thing, but it was solid. I crawled into the room, my movements agonizingly slow, fearing that every shift of my weight would make the floorboards groan like a dying animal. I found it. The iron was cold, the handle rough. Gripping it didn't make me feel brave, it made me feel pathetic. What was a piece of iron against a dozen men with silenced submachine guns and night vision? But the weight of it in my hand anchored me. It gave my fear a focal point. I wasn't just waiting to die anymore. I was waiting to swing. Elias? The refined voice was back. It was closer now, coming from the base of the stairs. He sounded like a father calling a child for dinner, a tone so incongruous with the situation that it made my skin crawl. Elias, you're making this very difficult for the cleanup crew. If you come down now, we can keep the mess contained to the foyer. If we have to come up there, the whole house will need to be repainted. And you know how hard it is to get blood out of unsealed concrete. It's porous, Elias. It drinks. He laughed, a soft, dry sound that was swallowed by the shadows. He started to climb. 1 step, 2. He wasn't rushing. He was giving me time to feel the walls closing in. He was savoring the hunt. I retreated into the walk-in closet of the master bedroom, a space lined with cedar that smelled of old wood and mothballs. I didn't shut the door all the way. I left a crack, a sliver of vision. I sat there in the dark, the fire poker held tight against my chest, watching the bedroom door. The house was a symphony of small, lethal noises, the hum of the rain on the roof, the distant click of a radio, the slow, rhythmic breathing of a man who was now standing just outside the bedroom. He didn't burst in. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges giving a low, mournful whine. The tactical light swept the room, bouncing off the mirrors, creating a strobe effect that disoriented me. Through the crack in the closet door, I saw him. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal gray overcoat that looked out of place with the tactical gear of his men. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't need to. He didn't expect me to be alive long enough to identify him. His face was aristocratic, high cheekbones, pale skin, and eyes that looked like they were made of glass. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. He tilted his head, sniffing the air like a hound. "Cedar," he whispered. "A classic choice, but a bit obvious, don't you think?" My heart stopped. He knew. He was playing with me. He walked toward the balcony doors instead of the closet, stepping out into the rain. I could see his silhouette against the gray sky. He stood there for a moment, letting the water soak into his coat, looking out over the valley. "You chose this place because you wanted to be alone," he said, raised his voice just enough to be heard over the rain. "You wanted to be the master of your own little mountain. But that's the problem with mountains, Elias. They belong to whoever has the longest reach, and right now, my reach is absolute." He turned back toward the room, and for a second, his eyes seemed to lock onto the crack in the closet door. I squeezed the iron poker until my knuckles popped. I was ready to lunge, to scream, to die in a flurry of useless violence. But then, one of his men appeared in the doorway. "Sir, the perimeter is secure. The signal jammer is at full capacity. But we have a problem. The safe in the basement. It's not what we expected." The man in the overcoat frowned, his aristocratic composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "What do you mean, not what you expected?" "It's empty, sir, and it's been open for a long time. There are traces. Someone was here before us. Someone who wasn't just renting." The leader turned his gaze back to the closet, but his expression had changed from predatory amusement to something sharper, something more calculating. He stepped closer to the closet, his hand reaching into his coat, pulling out a silenced pistol that looked like an extension of his own arm. "Elias," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hiss. "I think it's time we had a real conversation, because either you are the luckiest man alive or you are a very, very good liar." And I don't believe in luck. He was 5 feet away. 4. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the rain-damp wool of his coat. I could see the stitching on his gloves. I gathered my legs under me, the iron poker trembling in my grip. This was the moment. The threshold. The point where the isolation of the house would either become my grave or the birthplace of a ghost. Suddenly, from the ground floor, a massive explosion rocked the house. The glass walls of the living room shattered in a thunderous roar of flying shards. The floor beneath us buckled, and the man in the overcoat was thrown off balance, his shot going wild, splintering the cedar door inches from my face. The silence that followed was brief, broken by the sound of new, different footsteps, heavy, fast, and the sound of automatic gunfire that wasn't silenced. "Contact!" someone screamed from below. "We have contact! West side!" The leader scrambled to his feet, his face twisted in a snarl of pure rage. He didn't look at the closet again. He ran toward the door, barking orders into his radio. I sat in the dark, the dust from the ceiling falling like snow on my hair. The house was no longer a cage or a sanctuary. It was a war zone. And as I heard the sounds of a literal army clashing in my kitchen, I realized that I hadn't just moved to the edge of the city. I had moved to the center of a shadow war I didn't understand, and the men who had come for me were now the ones being hunted. I crawled out of the closet, the fire poker still in my hand, and looked out the shattered bedroom window. Down in the valley, a dozen more sets of headlights were winding their way up the ridge. This wasn't a hit. This was a massacre in progress. I looked at the iron poker, then at the stairs. The smoke from the explosion was rising through the house, thick and acrid. I had 2 choices: stay here and wait to see who won, or move through the fire and the blood to find a third way out. But as I reached the landing, I saw a figure standing in the smoke at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't one of the men in tactical gear. It was someone else. Someone who looked like they had been waiting for the world to end. The smoke rising from the foyer was a thick, oily curtain that tasted of burnt wiring and pulverized drywall. It swirled in the jagged gaps where the glass walls used to be, illuminated by the rhythmic, frantic strobing of the SUV headlights outside. I stood at the top of the stairs, clutching that pathetic iron poker, watching the figure at the bottom. It wasn't one of the sleek, tactical professionals who had besieged me. This person was different, wearing a heavy, grease-stained canvas coat, their face obscured by a gas mask that looked like a relic from a forgotten war. They didn't point a gun at me, they just stood there, staring through the bug-eyed lenses as the sounds of a frantic gunfight raged in the kitchen behind them. The house, my supposed sanctuary, was now breathing. Every time a gust of wind blew through the shattered windows, the building groaned, the structural integrity compromised by the blast. I realized then that the why of this situation was expanding into something far more vast and terrifying than a simple home invasion. The man in the overcoat had mentioned a safe. Traces. Traces of someone who wasn't just renting. My mind flashed back to the landlord, a man I'd only met once, a man with jittery hands and eyes that never stayed still. He hadn't been renting me a home. He had been renting me a decoy. "Down!" The figure at the bottom of the stairs suddenly barked. The voice was muffled by the mask, distorted into a metallic rasp. I didn't ask questions. I threw myself onto the landing just as a volley of rounds shredded the air where my head had been a second before. One of the tactical men had appeared in the kitchen doorway, his submachine gun spitting fire. The figure in the canvas coat reacted with a fluid, terrifying speed, drawing a short-barreled shotgun from beneath their coat and firing twice. The booms were tectonic, shaking the very foundation of the house. The tactical man was lifted off his feet and slammed back into the darkness of the kitchen. The figure looked back up at me. "Elias, if you want to live, you need to move now. Not in a minute. Now. They are calling in a secondary sweep, and they don't care about clean anymore. They're going to level the ridge. "Who are you?" I screamed over the roar of a new explosion, this one further down the driveway. "I'm the person who lived here before the world decided you were a convenient target," they replied, already moving toward the back of the house. "Follow my footsteps." Exactly. "The floor in the gallery is rigged." I scrambled to my feet, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I followed the stranger, bypassing the main stairs and heading toward a service ladder I hadn't even noticed behind a decorative wood panel. We descended into the crawl space, a cramped, dirt-floored hell that smelled of damp earth and old copper. Above us, the house was screaming. I could hear the heavy thud of boots directly over my head. The first team was retreating, and a second, more aggressive force was moving in. The sounds of glass breaking were constant now, a symphony of destruction. "They think the asset is in the basement safe," the stranger whispered as we crawled through the darkness. "They don't realize the house is the asset. The architecture is a transmitter, or it was until I pulled the core." None of it made sense. I was a writer. I wrote about history, about dead kings and fallen empires. I didn't belong in a sci-fi nightmare on the edge of a city. But as we emerged from a hidden hatch 50 yards away from the house, shielded by a dense thicket of pines, I saw the true scale of the madness. The house was glowing, not from fire, but from a pulsing internal light that bled through the cracks in the concrete. It was a deep, thrumming violet that made the hair on my arms stand up and the fillings in my teeth ache. The SUVs at the gate were no longer parked. They were being tossed aside like toys by an invisible force rippling out from the ridge. The men, the professionals, the killers, were screaming, clutching their heads as they collapsed into the gravel. "What is that?" I gasped, shielding my eyes. "That," the stranger said, stripping off the gas mask to reveal a face lined with scars and exhaustion, "is the reason they haven't killed you yet. They needed a biological signature to stabilize the surge. You were the renter. Your DNA has been soaking into the walls for 3 days. You're the key, Elias, and they're about to turn you." I looked back at the house. The man in the overcoat was crawling out of the shattered living room, his face bloody, his aristocratic poise gone. He wasn't looking for his men. He was looking for me. Even as the ground beneath him vibrated with a frequency that threatened to liquefy bone, he was reaching into his coat for a device, a small black cylinder that hummed with the same violet light as the house. He found me in the tree line. Our eyes met across the chaos. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked desperate. He started toward us, stumbling through the mud, his eyes fixed on me with a terrifying, singular focus. "Don't let him get close," the stranger yelled, raising the shotgun. But before they could fire, a second wave of vehicles roared up the ridge. These weren't SUVs. They were heavy, armored transport trucks, unmarked and silent. They didn't stop at the gate. They drove straight through the wreckage, their tires crushing the bodies of the first team without a second thought. Doors slid open, and men in white, pressurized suits stepped out, carrying long, tethered probes. The situation had shifted again. The bandits were being replaced by something more institutional, more cold. The man in the overcoat saw them and froze. He knew what they were. He turned back toward the house, his face a mask of pure terror, and began to run, not away from the house, but back into it. "He's going to overload it," the stranger cursed, grabbing my arm. "He'd rather wipe the ridge than let them have the data. We have to go, now." We ran. We ran into the deep woods, the branches tearing at my skin, the sound of the armored truck's sirens beginning to wail. A low, mournful sound that echoed through the valley like a funeral dirge. Behind us, the light from the house grew brighter, turning the night into an artificial violet day. The ground began to tilt, a localized earthquake triggered by whatever was happening on that ridge. I looked back one last time. The house on the edge of the city, my masterpiece of solitude, was no longer a building. It was a pillar of light, a beacon signaling to something far beyond the horizon. The men in the white suits were setting up a perimeter, their probes glowing as they drew energy from the air itself. I wasn't just a man who rented a house. I was a witness to something that wasn't supposed to exist. And as the stranger led me deeper into the mountains, away from the only life I had ever known, I realized the tapping on the glass hadn't been a warning. It had been an invitation. The city was still there in the distance, a million lights flickering in total ignorance of the war being fought on its borders. They thought they were safe in their homes, behind their deadbolts and their illusions. But I knew the truth now. The edge of the city isn't a place. It's a state of being. And once you cross it, there is no coming back. The stranger stopped at the mouth of a hidden cave, buried under a fall of rock. They turned to me, the violet light reflecting in their eyes. "They'll never stop looking for you now, Elias. You've been marked. The house is inside you." I looked at my hands. Under the skin, the veins were glowing with a faint, pulsing violet light. My heart wasn't beating like a human heart anymore. It was humming, a low-frequency vibration that matched the pulse of the ridge. The siege wasn't over. It was just moving. The cave was not a natural formation. It was a throat of cold steel and ancient stone, a bunker disguised by decades of neglect. As the stranger led me deeper, the hum in my chest intensified, a vibrating chord that resonated with the very walls of the earth. Outside, the world was ending in a violet flash. I could hear the ridge collapsing, the sound of the house, that brutalist masterpiece of glass and ego, imploding under the weight of its own impossible physics. But I didn't feel the shockwaves. I only felt the pull. "Sit," the stranger commanded, gesturing to a metal chair bolted to the center of a room filled with monitors and flickering vacuum tubes. I collapsed into the seat, my breath coming in shallow hitches. I looked at my hands again. The violet glow wasn't just in my veins anymore. It was beginning to leak through my pores, a luminous sweat that smelled like ozone and old parchment. I looked up at the stranger, who was now pulling off their heavy canvas coat. Underneath, they wore a suit of mesh and sensors, a mirror image of the men in white suits, but older, battered, and improvised. "Who am I, Elias?" they asked, leaning in close. "You still haven't asked the right question. You're still thinking like a man who rents a house. You need to start thinking like a man who is the house." "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice sounding like it was being broadcast from a great distance. "I'm a writer. I'm nobody." "You were nobody," the stranger corrected, their eyes softening with a pity that terrified me more than the gunman ever could. "But the man who built that ridge, the landlord you met, he didn't just build a home. He built a receiver. And he didn't pick you because of your credit score. He picked you because your neural patterns, the way you think, the way you structure your history, it's the only frequency that can translate what's coming through. You aren't a tenant. You are the hard drive." Suddenly, the monitors in the room flared to life. They didn't show camera feeds of the ridge. They showed my own memories, my childhood, the books I'd read, the faces of people I had long forgotten. But the memories were being distorted, woven into strange geometric patterns that pulsed with that same violet light. The men who came tonight? They aren't bandits. They're a recovery team for a corporation that has been waiting 50 years for that house to wake up. And the man in the overcoat? He was just the scout. The real force is already here. As if on cue, the heavy steel door of the bunker began to groan. Not from an explosion, but from a steady, overwhelming pressure. Something was pushing against it from the other side. Something that didn't use tools or fire, but sheer, focused intent. "It's time, Elias," the stranger said, handing me a small glass cylinder. "You have one choice. You can let them take you, let them strip your mind for the data and leave you a hollow shell. Or you can finish the transmission. You can become the ghost they're all looking for." The thrumming in my chest reached a crescendo. The room began to blur. The steel door buckled, the metal shrieking as it was torn like wet paper. In the doorway stood the man in the overcoat, but he was changed. His skin was translucent, his eyes glowing with a blinding white heat. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a conduit for the same force that was currently rewriting my DNA. "Give it to me, Elias," he spoke, but the words didn't come from his mouth. They echoed inside my skull, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "The history, the patterns, give us the key." I looked at the glass cylinder in my hand. It was a kill switch, or a catalyst. "Elias, don't!" the stranger screamed, reaching for their shotgun. But it was too late for weapons. I realized in that final, crystalline second that my life, the books, the solitude, the edge of the city, had all been a long, slow walk toward this exact room. I wasn't the victim of a home invasion. I was the arrival. I didn't break the cylinder. I didn't fight the man in the overcoat. I simply stopped resisting. I opened the door in my mind that I had kept locked since the first tap on the glass. The explosion wasn't physical. It was a burst of pure information. Every word I had ever written, every thought I had ever had, was suddenly projected outward in a wave of violet light. The bunker, the stranger, the man in the overcoat, they were all washed away in a sea of data. I felt myself expanding, my consciousness stretching across the ridge, through the city, into the very stars that looked down on the valley. I was no longer Elias. I was the transmission. The ridge fell silent. When the secondary recovery teams finally breached the bunker, they found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no iron poker. The only thing remaining was a single vintage typewriter sitting in the center of the room. A sheet of paper was fed into the carriage, and on it, a single sentence was typed over and over again, thousands of times, until the ink ran dry and the paper was torn. "I am no longer waiting for the world to end. I have become the end of the world." In the city, 5 miles away, people woke up with a strange humming in their ears. They looked at their reflection in the mirror, and for a split second, they didn't recognize who was looking back. The streetlights flickered in a pattern that no engineer could explain. And on the northern periphery, where the streetlights end and the silence begins, the ground where the house once stood remained cold. The solitude I had sought was finally mine, because when you become the silence itself, there is no one left to hear you. The siege was over, the tenant had moved out, and the edge of the city had finally moved in.